Why were four grown soldiers frozen in absolute terror, staring at a woman's lower back? And what could possibly make these same men drop to their knees, begging for mercy just minutes later? The answer wasn't what anyone expected, and it started with whispers. The desert sun had no mercy that afternoon. Alpha range baked under heat so brutal it turned metal tools into branding irons and made every breath feel like swallowing sand. The air shimmered with waves that made everything look like it was melting. The smell was pure military. Hot brass, diesel exhaust, that cocktail of sweat and machinery oil that clung to everything. Generators hummed constantly, punctuated by rifle fire from distant ranges. In the middle of all that controlled chaos, a woman worked without fanfare. Elena Torres didn't announce herself. She moved with quiet precision, her gray t-shirt dark with perspiration, brown cargo trousers functional and worn. She knelt beside the scaffolding, troweling concrete around anchor bolts with economical movements. Her hands traced each connection like she was reading a language written in metal. No wasted motion. Just methodical competence from someone who understood that lives depended on getting details right. Most of the soldiers moving through the area barely noticed her. Another contractor fixing another piece of equipment that would break again next month. Background noise in the endless maintenance cycle that kept a military base functional. But under the shade canopy, four infantry recruits had made her their entertainment. "Tell me that woman doesn't know how to work," one said, nudging his buddy. "Look at that form when she bends over." The others laughed with ugly appreciation. "What do you think, ex-military or fitness instructor who got lost?" Another one grinned. "Maybe she's just built for the job. You know what they say about contractors, engineered for torque." They dissolved into laughter that had an edge to it, sharp, mean, the kind that cut deeper than they probably intended. Elena didn't react, didn't even glance in their direction. She adjusted her position, tested the concrete's consistency with practiced fingers, and moved 2 paces to the left to start the next section. Her knee brace, worn and functional rather than decorative, caught the light briefly as she settled into a new working stance. Small details, things most people wouldn't notice, but there were men watching who should have paid attention. The man watching her most intently wasn't participating in the jokes. Corporal Owen Locke stood with arms folded, jaw working like he was chewing on an idea. Late 20s with confidence that came from wearing chevrons but never being tested. His uniform was regulation perfect, but his eyes held the calculating look of someone searching for angles to exploit. He'd been having a rough month, failed his NCO course, passed over for promotion, looking for someone to take it out on. And right there, working alone, quiet, not making waves, was exactly the kind of target men like him always found. "You know what?" Locke said. "I think we should check what she's doing, make sure she's following safety protocols." One of the privates glanced at him uncertainly. "She looks like she knows what she's doing, Corp. Appearances can be deceiving," Locke replied, already starting to walk toward her. "And we've got a responsibility to ensure all non-military personnel are operating within established guidelines." The others followed, drawn by that magnetic pull of potential confrontation that young soldiers found irresistible. They spread out slightly as they approached, not quite surrounding her but definitely establishing a presence that couldn't be ignored. Elena sensed the shift before she heard their footsteps. Something in the quality of the silence behind her changed, became focused, predatory. She glanced over her shoulder once, just long enough to catalog 4 men approaching with the kind of swagger that preceded trouble. She went back to her work, but her shoulders tightened, almost imperceptibly. Her stance shifted. Weight distributed differently, and when she traced a line in the dust with her boot, it curved like a hook instead of running straight. Small adjustments that most people would miss, but that spoke of training that went deeper than civilian contractor credentials, because Elena Torres wasn't just someone who fixed infrastructure. And the moment these soldiers decided to test her, they were going to learn exactly what that meant. But not yet, not the way they expected. First, they had to push. First, they had to cross lines they didn't even know existed. First, they had to become the kind of men who would regret this moment for the rest of their lives. What happens when bureaucracy becomes a weapon? When regulations get twisted into tools of humiliation, Elena was about to show them exactly how that game was played and lost. Locke's shadow fell across her work. She'd flagged a kink in the cable sleeve twice already, the kind that would jam rounds and cause malfunctions, the kind that could get someone killed. "I need to see your clearance documentation," Locke said, his tone carrying artificial authority, the voice of someone playing a role they'd practiced in the mirror. Elena straightened slowly, deliberately, like someone who'd been interrupted too many times to be surprised anymore. "My clearance is current. 2 levels above what this requires. New security protocols require verification of all non-uniform personnel." She handed over her folder without comment, official papers, properly stamped, clearance codes that should have ended it immediately. Locke examined them like an expert, which he wasn't. "Says infrastructure assessment, doesn't include electrical systems. Infrastructure includes all support systems. Has since the update 3 months ago." One private snickered. "She knows the regs better than you, Corp." But Locke wasn't backing down. Men like him never did, not when their pride was on the line, not when backing down meant admitting they'd started something they couldn't finish. Regulations updated again. New electromagnetic security protocols. Can't have unauthorized electronics near sensitive equipment. Need you to verify you're not carrying contraband devices. The duty sergeant looked up from his clipboard, frowning. "Locke, what the hell?" "Routine security checks, Sergeant." "Such as?" Elena asked. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the kind of calm that came from being in situations far worse than this. Phones, recording equipment, transmitters could be concealed in clothing, full compliance check required. Conversations nearby dropped to murmurs. People had started noticing. Something was crossing a line here, something felt wrong. Strip search, upper body inspection, standard procedure for uncleared personnel. That was a lie, everyone knew it, but Locke was banking on her not wanting to cause a scene. Another private pulled out his phone. "This might be worth recording." "Put that away," Rodriguez hissed, but the kid just grinned. Consequences felt distant when you were young and stupid and surrounded by people just as young and stupid as you were. Elena stood there for a long moment, looking at this boy who thought he could humiliate her. She could have called for the sergeant, demanded his superior, walked away. Made a formal complaint that would have ended his career before lunch. Instead, she set the folder down and started unbuttoning her trousers. "Jesus, she's actually doing it," the kid whispered. The phone was still recording, capturing everything, documenting his own downfall without realizing it. She pulled them down to her knees and stood there, posture straight, expression unchanged, like this wasn't the first time someone had tried to break her, like she'd been through things that made this moment feel almost quaint. The soldiers stared with ugly curiosity, waiting for her to crack, waiting for tears, waiting for the satisfaction of seeing someone crumble. "Satisfied?" she asked. Locke's grin widened. He'd won, or so he thought. Turn around, full inspection. And that's when everything changed. That's when 4 men who thought they controlled the situation realized they just made the worst mistake of their military careers. As Elena turned, the afternoon sun caught something on her lower back that made the atmosphere shift like someone had flipped a switch. It wasn't decorative ink. It wasn't something she'd gotten on a drunken weekend or chosen from a flash book in some strip mall tattoo parlor. 5 stark horizontal marks ran parallel across her spine just above her waistband. Each mark was different, precise, angular, like technical diagrams burned into skin, a gas mask silhouette, satellite coordinates, a syringe crossed with lightning bolts, a drone outline, and a skull wearing night vision goggles. Most watching didn't understand what they were looking at. The kid was still recording. Check out the back art, probably got those near basic training. But Rodriguez felt something cold settle in his stomach, deep and instinctive, the kind of fear that came from recognizing danger you couldn't see but knew was there. He'd seen markings like that before, in his grandfather's photos. Unit identifiers for groups that didn't officially exist, mission tallies for operations that never happened. Scars that told stories no one was allowed to hear. And that's when Sergeant Major Darius Hurley walked around the corner with 2 officers. The clipboard in his hand hit the concrete with a sharp crack that echoed across the work area like a gunshot. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Because when Sergeant Major Hurley showed up unannounced, it meant something serious was about to happen. And when he saw Elena Torres standing there with her trousers around her knees and 4 soldiers surrounding her like a firing squad, the expression on his face went from confused to horrified to absolutely furious in the span of a heartbeat. What in the name of God is happening here? His voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. It carried the weight of 30 years in uniform and zero tolerance for the kind of stupidity he was witnessing. Locke turned, confidence draining from his face like water through a sieve. "Sergeant Major, we were conducting a routine security check on this contractor." "Contractor?" Hurley's voice could have cut steel. He looked at Elena, really looked at her. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Ms. Torres," she pulled her trousers up with the same calm efficiency she'd used to take them down. "Sergeant Major, are you harmed?" "No, Sergeant Major." "Did these men touch you?" "No, Sergeant Major." Hurley's jaw worked. His hands clenched and unclenched. Men who'd served under him for years had never seen him this angry, this barely controlled. "Locke. Rodriguez, Patterson, Williams, you have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you thought it was appropriate to conduct an unauthorized search on a civilian contractor. Starting now." But how do you explain the unexplainable? How do you justify humiliation disguised as duty? Locke tried. His voice shook. Words tumbled out in a desperate attempt to make this look like anything other than what it was. Something about security protocols, new regulations, electromagnetic interference. Every excuse sounded weaker than the last. Hurley let him finish. Let him dig the hole deeper. Then he turned to Elena. "Ms. Torres, with your permission, I'd like to clarify something for these gentlemen." She nodded once. Hurley addressed the soldiers. His voice was ice. "This woman you just humiliated. She holds security clearances 3 levels above mine. Her service record is classified at levels most of you couldn't even imagine exist. Those marks on her back, they're not decorations. They're mission tallies. Each one represents an operation where she put her life on the line for objectives you'll never know about in places that don't exist on any map." The color drained from Locke's face. "She's done more for this country's security in a single deployment than all 4 of you will do in your entire careers combined. And you treated her like she was nothing." The words hung in the desert air, heavy, final, damning. Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. The kid with the phone had stopped recording. Patterson stared at the ground like he was trying to disappear into it, but Locke just stood there, processing the magnitude of what he'd done. Understanding, maybe for the first time in his life, that actions had consequences, that power without wisdom was just cruelty. That the quiet ones, the ones who didn't need to announce themselves, were often the ones you should have respected most. "All of you, report to my office at 1500 hours. Do not speak to each other. Do not discuss this incident. Do not even breathe wrong between now and then. Am I understood?" "Yes, Sergeant Major." Their voices were barely whispers. One of the officers stepped forward, a captain with intelligence insignia. He approached Elena with the careful respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone here, I apologize. This should never have happened." "Noted, Captain. If you need medical evaluation, counseling support, or wish to file formal charges, I'm fine, thank you." But was she? Could anyone really be fine after something like this? After being reduced to an object? After having her dignity stripped away by people who should have known better? Elena's face showed nothing. Years of training. Years of operations where showing emotion meant death. But somewhere inside, in places she'd learned to lock away, there had to be something. Anger, hurt, exhaustion at having to prove herself again, always again. Even after everything she'd done. Everything she'd sacrificed. The work area had gone silent, 50 people standing witness. Some looked ashamed, some looked angry on her behalf, some just looked confused, trying to process what they'd seen, trying to understand how something that started as cruel entertainment had turned into a career-ending disaster. Hurley gestured to one of the female officers. "Captain Morrison, please escort Ms. Torres to a private area. Ensure she has everything she needs." Yes, Sergeant Major. As Elena walked away, escorted with the kind of courtesy she should have received from the beginning, Locke finally found his voice. Sergeant Major, I didn't know. If I'd known who she was, Hurley cut him off. That's exactly the problem, Corporal, you didn't know. And instead of treating her with basic human decency regardless of who she was, you chose humiliation. You chose cruelty. You chose to abuse your authority to make yourself feel powerful. Locke opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. What could he possibly say? What excuse could make this better? Dismissed, all of you. 1500 hours, my office. If you're even 1 minute late, you'll wish you'd never enlisted. They scattered. 4 men who'd woken up that morning thinking they controlled their world. 4 men who now understood they'd controlled nothing. Hurley stood there for a long moment, watching Elena disappear into the administrative building. Then he picked up his clipboard and went back to work. Because the mission continued, even when people failed, even when lessons were learned the hard way, the mission always continued. But sometimes those lessons changed everything. Sometimes they rippled out in ways no one could predict. Sometimes one moment of cruelty exposed in the harsh desert sun became the catalyst for something larger, something that would transform an entire base, an entire culture, an entire understanding of what respect actually meant. What happens when the consequences arrive? When the weight of your actions becomes too heavy to carry? When you realize that the person you broke was never actually broken at all? Locke was about to find out, and it was going to be worse than anything he'd imagined. At 1500 hours, Corporal Owen Locke stood outside Sergeant Major Hurley's office. His dress uniform was perfect, every crease sharp, every button polished, but his hands trembled slightly. His supervisor, Staff Sergeant Mills, waited beside him with the kind of expression that said this conversation wasn't going to end well for anyone involved. "Remember," Mills said quietly, "tell the truth. Don't try to justify what happened." The door opened. Hurley's aide gestured them in without a word. The office was Spartan. No personal decorations, no photos of family or commendations on the walls, just maps, organizational charts. The functional space of a man who cared about work, not appearances. Hurley sat behind his desk. 2 other officers flanked him, a major from JAG, a lieutenant colonel from intelligence. This wasn't a counseling session. This was a reckoning. "Corporal Locke, do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, Sergeant Major. Explain it to me." Locke swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. "I conducted an unauthorized search on a civilian contractor. I abused my authority. I failed to treat her with appropriate respect." "That's a start. But you're missing something crucial." Hurley leaned forward. "You didn't just humiliate a contractor. You humiliated someone who served this country in ways you can't begin to comprehend. Someone whose sacrifices make your service look like a vacation. Someone who has earned more respect in one deployment than you'll earn in a lifetime." The JAG major spoke for the first time. "We've reviewed the incident report, the witness statements, the video recording." Locke's stomach dropped. The video, evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. "What you did today constitutes harassment, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming. In a civilian context, it would be assault. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir." "Only reason you're not facing court-martial right now is because Ms. Torres declined to press charges. She said, and I quote, 'They're young and stupid. Everyone deserves one chance to learn better.' Do you understand what kind of grace that represents?" Locke felt something break inside him, not his pride, not his ego, something deeper. The comfortable certainty that he was one of the good guys, that his actions were justified. That power meant he was right. "She showed you more mercy than you showed her. Remember that." The intelligence lieutenant colonel spoke next. "Let me explain something about the woman you humiliated, Corporal, without revealing classified information. She has operated in 7 combat zones under non-official cover. She has provided intelligence that prevented attacks on American soil. She has risked her life repeatedly for missions that will never be acknowledged. Those marks on her back, each one represents a classified operation, a mission where failure meant death." Locke wanted to disappear, wanted to sink into the floor, wanted to be anywhere but in this room hearing these words. "And you treated her like she was nothing, like she was an object for your entertainment, like her dignity was something you could take away because you wore a uniform and she didn't. Hurley pulled out a folder, Locke's personnel file. Failed your NCO course, passed over for promotion. Performance reviews showing attitude problems and difficulty accepting authority. You've been looking for someone to make yourself feel better, someone weaker than you, someone you could push around. Sergeant Major, I'm not finished. Hurley's voice was granite. Men like you are a cancer in this organization. You wear the uniform, but you don't understand what it stands for. You think authority means power over others. It doesn't. It means responsibility for others. It means being worthy of the trust placed in you. It means treating everyone with dignity because that's what honor requires. The room was silent except for the distant sound of training exercises. Locke felt tears building behind his eyes, fought them down, failed. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know, but sorry doesn't undo what happened. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation you caused. Sorry doesn't fix the damage you've done to your own character. Hurley laid out the consequences: extra duty for 8 weeks, mandatory training on treatment of personnel with classified backgrounds, a letter of reprimand in his permanent file, recommendation that he spend considerable time thinking about what leadership actually meant. You will also write a formal apology to Ms. Torres, not because I'm ordering you to, but because it's the right thing to do, and you will mean every word. Because if I sense even a hint of insincerity, these consequences will look merciful compared to what comes next. Yes, Sergeant Major. Dismissed. Locke stood, saluted, turned to leave. Corporal, he stopped. You're young, you're stupid, but you're not beyond redemption. What you do with this moment will define the rest of your career, the rest of your life. Choose wisely. Yes, Sergeant Major. As Locke left the office, the weight of what he'd done settled on his shoulders like physical mass. He walked through the base seeing it differently now, seeing the contractors working, the civilian personnel maintaining equipment, the quiet people doing essential jobs without recognition or fanfare. How many of them had stories he'd never know? How many of them had served in ways he couldn't imagine? How many of them deserved respect he'd never bothered to give? Rodriguez found him that evening in the enlisted club. Locke was staring into a beer he wasn't drinking. Mind if I sit? Locke shrugged. Rodriguez settled into the chair across from him, waited, let the silence build. You know what you did today, son? Everyone keeps asking me that question. Because everyone wants to make sure you learn from it. Rodriguez had 20 years in, had seen things, had made mistakes of his own and learned from them. That woman you embarrassed, she's the kind of person this whole base exists to support, the kind who does the jobs that let the rest of us sleep safely at night. Locke looked up. How do you know that? 30 years in this business, you learn to recognize certain indicators. The way she handled her tools, the way she found problems we'd missed completely, the way she carried herself when you tried to break her down. Rodriguez paused. But mostly it was the way Sergeant Major Hurley reacted. I've never seen him look like that before, like he was personally ashamed, like we'd all failed something fundamental. Locke was quiet for a moment, processing. What should I have done differently? Asked questions before making assumptions. Treated her with the respect you'd want if you were in her position. Remembered that the uniform is supposed to mean something beyond just authority over other people. The conversation drifted. Rodriguez shared stories, times he'd misjudged people, times he'd learned hard lessons, times he'd been humbled by discovering that the quiet ones often had the loudest stories. My grandfather served in Vietnam, Rodriguez said, worked military intelligence. He told me about people like her, the ones who did the jobs that never happened in places we never were, against threats we never officially faced. He said you could always identify them, the way they moved, the way they observed everything without seeming to watch, the way they carried themselves like they'd been through hell and found their way back. Locke said nothing. You humiliated a war hero today, someone who probably saved more lives than you'll ever know about, and you did it because you thought she looked vulnerable. How was I supposed to know? That's exactly the point. You don't know who you're dealing with until you take the time to find out, and by then, it might be too late to make a different first impression. Rodriguez stood, clapped Locke on the shoulder once. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement that they were all human, all fallible, all capable of better. Learn from this, be better, that's all anyone can ask. He walked away, leaving Locke alone with his thoughts and his beer and the crushing weight of understanding. Outside, the desert wind caught the edge of a flag. The base continued its endless rhythm, training, maintenance, preparation, but something had shifted, something fundamental. And that shift was just beginning to ripple outward. Because word was spreading, through shift briefings and maintenance meetings, through NCO discussions and casual conversations over coffee, not the gossip version, not the entertainment, the principle behind it. Treat people with respect until they prove they don't deserve it. Ask questions before making judgments. Remember that you never know who you're dealing with until it's too late to change your approach. The lessons were taking root, slowly, painfully, but taking root nonetheless. When does change actually happen? When does one moment become a movement? When does a single incident transform an entire culture? The answer wasn't immediate. Change never is. But 3 weeks later, when the next civilian contractor showed up for equipment maintenance at Alpha Range, the atmosphere was different. The crew was professional, courteous, helpful. They asked about qualifications instead of making assumptions, offered assistance instead of creating obstacles. The contractor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and calloused hands, noticed the difference immediately. "This your usual approach?" he asked the crew chief. "Or did something happen?" The crew chief, a staff sergeant with 15 years in, smiled slightly. "Let's just say we learned an important lesson recently, about respect, about assumptions, about treating people right regardless of who they are." The contractor nodded. "Didn't push. Didn't need to. Whatever had happened here had left a mark. The good kind, the kind that made people better." Master Sergeant Williams had made it part of his orientation program for new personnel. Not the specific incident that stayed at Alpha Range, contained and protected, but the concept behind it. The understanding that quiet competence deserved recognition, that humility often masked experience, that the military worked best when people took care of each other instead of looking for people to push around. "You know what the hardest lesson in this business is?" he told a group of fresh privates during their first week. "It's learning that strength doesn't always look like what you expect. The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. The quietest person might be the one who's been through things you can't imagine." They listened. Young faces, eager, uncertain, trying to figure out who they were going to become in this world. Treat everyone with dignity. Everyone. The contractors fixing your equipment, the civilians processing your paperwork, the janitor cleaning your barracks, because you never know their story. You never know what they've done, what they've sacrificed, what they've survived. He didn't tell them about Elena Torres, didn't share the details, but he gave them the principle, the foundation, the understanding that would hopefully prevent them from making the same mistakes others had made. Sergeant Major Hurley kept Elena's maintenance report on his desk for months afterward, not because it was unusual, though her recommendations had prevented 3 potential equipment failures that could have cost lives, but because it represented something he wanted his people to remember. Excellence didn't announce itself with fanfare. It just showed up, did the necessary work, left things better than it found. The report sat there like a quiet reminder, a reference point, a symbol of what service actually meant. And somewhere in the civilian world, Elena Torres continued her quiet mission, moving from base to base, contract to contract. Her service remained classified, her sacrifices unrecognized by the public, her stories untold in any official record. She'd finish a job at one facility and move to the next, maintaining equipment, fixing problems, ensuring that the machines of war worked when they needed to, supporting the mission from the shadows where she'd always operated. But she'd left behind something at Alpha Range, a training facility full of people who would never again assume that silence meant weakness, who would never again think that someone working alone was someone they could safely ignore, who understood, finally, that the most dangerous people are often the ones who don't need to tell you how dangerous they are. Locke served his extra duty without complaint. 8 weeks of additional responsibilities, cleaning, maintenance, the unglamorous work that kept a base functional. He did it quietly, thoroughly, without the attitude that had defined him before, The letter of reprimand sat in his file, a permanent mark, a reminder every time someone reviewed his career that he'd made a critical mistake, that he'd learned a hard lesson, that he'd been given a chance to be better. Some might see it as career-ending. He chose to see it as career-defining. The apology letter took him 3 days to write. He started it a dozen times. Each version felt hollow, insincere, full of excuses and justifications. Finally, he stripped it down to the truth. I was wrong. I abused my authority. I humiliated someone who deserved respect. I have no excuse. I can only promise to learn from this and be better. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for who I was. And I'm committed to becoming someone worthy of the uniform I wear. He sent it through official channels, didn't expect a response, didn't receive one. But 3 months later, during another equipment inspection at Alpha Range, a different contractor arrived. A woman in her 40s with efficient movements and quiet competence. She worked with the same methodical precision, the same attention to detail. Locke approached her, but this time with respect. "Ma'am, I'm Corporal Locke. I'm assigned to support today's inspection. Is there anything you need?" She looked at him. Assessed him the way experienced people assessed everything. "I'm good for now, thank you, Corporal. If that changes, I'll be over by the supply shed, just let me know." She nodded, went back to her work. Later, as she was packing up, she stopped by where Locke was organizing equipment. "You the one who had the incident with Tors?" Locke froze. "Yes, ma'am. She told me about it, said you wrote a good apology, said she thought you might actually learn from it." "I'm trying to, ma'am." "Good, because this world needs people who can admit when they're wrong, who can learn, who can grow." She handed him her card. "If you ever want to know more about what we do, about the work that happens in the background, let me know. People like you who have made mistakes and owned them sometimes make the best supporters." She walked away. Left Locke standing there with a business card and the understanding that redemption wasn't a single moment. It was a process, a choice made repeatedly. A commitment to being better than you were. The base continued its rhythm, training cycles, deployments, returns. New soldiers arrived, old soldiers left. The work never stopped, but the culture had shifted, imperceptibly at first. Then more obviously, people treated contractors differently, asked questions, showed respect, recognized that the quiet professionals maintaining their equipment might have stories worth honoring. And on a Thursday afternoon, 6 months after the incident, Elena Tors returned to Alpha Range for a follow-up inspection. She drove through the gate with the same calm efficiency she'd shown before, parked in the visitor lot, gathered her tools. The duty sergeant recognized her, stood a little straighter. "Ms. Tors, welcome back. We've been expecting you." "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll let the crew chief know you're here. And ma'am, if anyone gives you any trouble at all, you let me know immediately." She smiled slightly. "I appreciate that, Sergeant." The work area had been prepared, tools organized, equipment ready. The crew chief, a new staff sergeant who'd heard the stories but never met her, approached with professional courtesy. "Ms. Tors, I'm Staff Sergeant Chen. I'll be your point of contact today. We've reviewed your previous report and implemented all your recommendations." "Glad to hear it, Sergeant. If you need anything at all, you just let me know. We're here to support your work." It was a small thing, professional courtesy, basic respect, but it meant something. It meant the lessons had taken root, meant the culture had changed, meant that one terrible moment had become a catalyst for something better. Elena worked through the afternoon, found a few minor issues, nothing critical, documented everything with the same meticulous attention to detail that defined her work. As she was finishing, Sergeant Major Hurley appeared. "Ms. Tors, good to see you again." "Sergeant Major, everything satisfactory." "Very much so. Your crews have been excellent." "Good, that's what I like to hear." He paused. "I wanted to thank you for how you handled the incident, for giving those men a chance to learn instead of destroying their careers. That was more grace than they deserved." "Everyone deserves one chance, Sergeant Major. What they do with it is up to them." "Locke's doing better. He's changed, really changed. Still has a long way to go, but he's trying." "I'm glad to hear it." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the training areas where young soldiers were learning to trust their lives to equipment maintained by people they'd never meet. "Because those kids need to understand that the quiet ones have stories too, and sometimes those stories matter more than the loud ones." She walked out into the desert heat, footsteps steady on the concrete pathway. Behind her, the work area returned to its normal rhythms: maintenance, preparation, the endless cycle of keeping a military base functional. But something fundamental had shifted in that space, something that would ripple through conversations and attitudes for months to come, maybe years, maybe longer. Because when you witness something transformative, you carry it with you. When you see someone's dignity stripped away and then watch them choose grace over vengeance, it changes your perspective. When you learn that strength comes in forms you didn't expect, you start looking for it everywhere. The desert wind caught the edge of Elena's shirt as she reached the base gate, lifting it just enough to reveal the top edge of those mission tallies. The guard who processed her departure was a senior sergeant. 25 years in service. He'd seen enough classified operations to recognize certain kinds of marks when he saw them. He didn't ask questions, just nodded respectfully, handed back her credentials. "Have a good evening, ma'am." "You too, Sergeant." And as she drove away into the desert sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of work done well. Missions completed. Lessons taught without needing to teach them. Because sometimes the most powerful message isn't spoken. Sometimes it's shown. Sometimes it's lived. In the way you carry yourself. In the way you respond to cruelty with dignity. In the way you choose grace when vengeance would be easier. Locke stood at his window that evening, watching the maintenance crews prepare equipment for tomorrow's exercises. The letter of reprimand was still in his file, would always be in his file, but it didn't define him anymore. It reminded him of who he'd been, of who he'd chosen to become, of the ongoing work of being better. Rodriguez walked past, stopped. "You good, Locke?" "Yeah, I think I am." "Good, you coming to the briefing?" "Wouldn't miss it." They walked together, two soldiers among thousands, part of something larger than themselves, part of a mission that continued regardless of individual failures or successes, part of a culture that was slowly, painfully learning to honor the quiet ones, the ones who served in shadows, the ones whose stories would never be told, the ones whose sacrifices would never be recognized, but who deserved respect nonetheless. Because in the end, that's what service means. Not the recognition, not the glory, not the headlines or medals or commendations, just the quiet knowledge that you did the work that needed doing, that you maintained the equipment, that you supported the mission, that you showed up day after day, doing your part, making sure that the people on the front lines had what they needed to come home safe. And sometimes dignity doesn't need to speak. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need validation or recognition or applause. Sometimes it just shows up, does the necessary work, leaves things better than it found them, and walks away into the desert sunset, carrying stories no one will ever hear. That's the real heroism, the quiet kind, the kind that changes lives without needing credit, the kind that transforms cultures through example rather than proclamation, the kind that reminds us all that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize, until we're forced to, until we're humbled by it, until we understand, finally, that the person we dismissed might be the person we should have honored most. Have you ever underestimated someone because they chose silence over noise? Because they moved through the world without announcing themselves? Because they seemed ordinary until the moment you realized they were anything but? That's the lesson Alpha Range learned. That's the lesson that spread through an entire base. That's the lesson that changed how people saw contractors, civilians, the quiet professionals working in the background, making sure the mission succeeded. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who don't need to tell you how dangerous they are. Sometimes the real heroes are the ones who never get recognition ceremonies. And sometimes, when you think you know exactly who you're dealing with, you discover you don't know anything at all. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.